Article before weak letters. This module will look at what happens when we attach the article to words that begin with letters that cannot double. If you remember, our article has three parts. We have the consonant, he, the vowel, which is a patach, and following that we have the doubling of the next consonant, or the gemination of the next consonant. So this is a Dagesh forte. Remember, three parts. This is the part that people tend to forget. But what happens if the letter that's sitting here, the first letter of your word, can't double? Then other things need to happen. And we've seen two groups of letters that do that. One is gutturals and resh, and the other are the coal mine letters. Now, the rules for attaching articles to weak letters are complicated. At least I find them a bit of a mess. And I've tried to simplify this as much as possible. The best way I could think of doing this was simply to put it all into one chart, and we'll go through it. So it'll look a bit intimidating at first, but we'll walk through it. So here's our chart. Now, let me talk you through this. Note first of all how this chart works. On the left here we have the four types of things that happen. In some cases the Dagesh will simply be omitted. In other cases we'll have what we call implied doubling or virtual doubling. In other words, we're going to say, okay, we don't see any doubling, but we're going to pretend it's happening for a reason. Another is compensatory lengthening. This is where the vowel that precedes the guttural changes, it lengthens to compensate for the fact we don't have doubling. We've seen this before. We saw this in the case of quiescent aleph. If aleph loses its vowel, effectively making the word shorter, then the vowel previous to it will tend to lengthen. It'll lengthen to compensate. And finally, there's something called harmonization, where the vowel under the first root letter will harmonize with the vowel under the article. So, the four categories of things that can happen. Now, in the first one here, we notice we have a yud and a mem. This is what happens with a couple of the coal mine letters. The rest of these all concern gutturals and resh. And, okay, so why don't we jump right into the chart here and look at the first section. So Dagesh is omitted in the case of a mem or a yud. Now these are only two of the coal mine letters. It doesn't happen to all the coal mine letters, but the mem and the yud, remember those are part of the coal mine mnemonic. If they're followed by a vocal shava, they will drop the Dagesh, no Dagesh present. The vowel under the article stays the same. This is normal, ha, with the patach. And here's an example. Yiladim means children, and it starts with a yud. You put the article on it, the hey, and the patach. We would expect the yud to be doubled, but in fact it doesn't. Now, there is an exception to this rule. The exception is that if these, the yud and the mem, are followed by two of the gutturals, the ayin and the hey, then in fact the Dagesh will stay. Again, the vowel is normal, so there's no change there. So here we had hayiladim, or hailadim, I suppose I should say that, where the Dagesh is no longer there in the yud. However, Yehudim, Jews, the Dagesh is there, if you can see that. And that's because this yud is followed by hey, following this exception here. So, Dagesh is omitted with two of the coal mine letters, except for this exception, where it stays. Let's look at the gutturals and resh. Now, the gutturals and resh can be divided into two groups, or gutturals can be divided into two groups. The hey and the chet are called your strong gutturals. They're ones you pronounce. The aleph and the ayin are you either don't pronounce them that strongly, or they aren't pronounced at all. The ayin can be pronounced, but is a weak guttural, considered a weak guttural in comparison to these. And resh is grouped there. Now, what happens with the strong gutturals? The strong gutturals, you don't get gemination, you don't get doubling, which is the case for all these here. The only case where you actually have doubling here is this exception to the coal mine rule. Okay, so otherwise what we're dealing with here are cases where you don't have doubling. So it'll be no all the way down this column. No Dagesh present. Now in the case of the He and the Chet, there's no change to the vowel either. So Hechal, which means temple or palace, you add the article and it's just Ha-Hechal. Or Chochmah, which is wisdom, you add the article and it's just Ha-Chochmah. You don't have any change to the vowel, and you don't have the dagesh. So why do they call this implied doubling? They call this implied doubling, while in this case it's dagesh omitted. What's the difference? It looks the same, doesn't it? What's going on is this. In this case, you have a vocal shava under your yud, your first root vowel. Here you have some other type of vowel. When you have a vocal shava and you add the article takes that yud and makes it a closed syllable. So now this yud is part of the closed syllable. So you have CVC, CVC, a closed syllable, with a short vowel, and that's permitted. In this case, you have a consonant and a vowel, and that's it. This doesn't take this as its next consonant to make a closed syllable. You have an open syllable. And the open syllable, CV, has a short vowel. If you remember back to our rules of syllabification, CV unstressed should have a long vowel. In this case, it has a short vowel up here. The patach stays. And that's a short vowel, and that's not permitted. So what they say is, okay, we don't see a dagesh there, but really there is doubling happening, we just don't mark it. So I suppose you could say this is a CVC with an implied C there, final C. So that's why they call this implied doubling or virtual doubling, while this is just dagesh omitted. Let me get rid of this other thing here. Okay, so strong gutturals produce implied doubling. Weak gutturals produce compensatory lengthening. Again, you can't double them, but what you get is a lengthening of the vowel that precedes it. So with ish, for instance, meaning man, you have ha-ish, where the ha, the patach, changes to a kametz. There's no doubling here, and so it lengthens there. Similarly, ir, which means city, changes to ha'ir with the kametz rather than the patach. The patach, like this, lengthens to a kametz. And here's an example with reish, regel, meaning foot. Again, you have the kametz there. So, compensatory lengthening. Now, in both these cases, the strong and the weak gutturals, you have an exception. Exception conditions are here. For the strong ones, if you have a patach, if you have a kametz following these, or a chataf kametz, you get he. And that sounds quite different. He harim, the mountains, as opposed to ha-harim. He chacham, the wisdom, the wise man. This was the wisdom. He chodashim, the months. And down here, if you have a kametz under the ayin, just the ayin, you also get the same exception. It goes to he, so you have he'avim, the clouds. Now, the exceptions here occur with kametz, when kametz is under the guttural. In these two cases, and also here, and here you have a chataf kametz. And it produces the same exception. So note this here. There are conditions where you'll get he, which sounds quite different than ha. Finally, there's something called harmonization. Harmonization happens with an accented, when the first letter of the word is an accented ha or a. So a he with the kametz or an ayin with the kametz. And what happens then is that, let's look at some examples here. The vowel under the first root letter, in this case the aleph, will harmonize to match the vowel under the article. Now what I suggest here is simply just to memorize these four words and note that harmonization can happen. So eretz becomes haaretz, the land. Har, hahar, where they're both kametzes. In all these cases, they're both kametz. Ha'am, the people. Ha'avel, the iniquity. And this will tend to happen for words that are either monosyllabic or have the accent on the first syllable, because part of the requirement here is that the first letter be accented. So, what do you do with all this? What I would do is this. There's a lot of information here. I would keep a chart like this handy. A chart like this is available. And when you encounter them, glance at the chart to refresh yourself as to what category you're dealing with. Note that with these two coal mine letters and the gutturals and resh, you won't get doubling, with one little exception. Note that the vowel can change. He is the most prominent. It'll look quite different. It'll sound quite different. Ha will look different, but probably not sound different because you say it the same as these. And so note that the article can have he and ha. That's why I've colored these here. They're different. Be familiar with these categories. Doggers can be omitted. You can have implied doubling, which means that it's omitted, but we're going to pretend it's there. Compensatory lengthening, we've already seen. A vowel that precedes what should be doubling lengthens in order to compensate for the fact that this isn't doubling. And harmonization, where you get both vowels in the article and the first root letter harmonizing to be the same thing. Well, I hope that isn't too bad. I don't know how to make it any simpler than this.